Good afternoon. Welcome to Metropolitan. Is there any problems? My screen changed. Okay. Welcome to Metropolitan Community College's continued programming to honor LGBTQIA+ pride. My name is Barbara Velasquez. I am delighted to have you with us today to watch an important documentary about LGBTQIA+ global matters, yet within U.S. borders. We will view the documentary and then have the amazing pleasure of hearing from the film's producer during our Q&A period. Your microphones and chat with other audience members are turned off. Send questions to moderator Barbara Velasquez at any time for the discussion after the film. Also watch for a link in the chat for an online evaluation. Unsettled, Seeking Refuge in America is a feature-length documentary revealing the untold stories of LGBTQ refugees and asylum seekers who have fled intense persecution from their home countries and who are resettling in the United States. The film follows 4 new arrivals, each of whom have escaped potential peril in their native countries for being different. They've landed in the purported gay mecca of San Francisco, yet even there, building a new life in an adopted nation is a precarious undertaking. As new leadership in America continues to restrict immigrants and drastically cut the flow of refugees and asylum seekers, Unsettled sheds light on a group about which few people know. What are the costs persecuted immigrants pay for seeking refuge? And how are everyday Americans stepping forward to help those most in need? So I mentioned earlier that the film's producer, Mr. Tom Shepard, will be with us after the viewing. Please take notes while watching Unsettled, Seeking Refuge in America. It will help you develop questions for the discussion period, which make the whole experience better for everybody. And you can send those questions to me, moderator Barbara Velasquez, at any time during the documentary. I really can't wait to see what interests you most about Unsettled, Seeking Refuge in America. I'm really excited to introduce you to Director of Unsettled, Seeking Refuge in America, Mr. Tom Shepard. For over 20 years, filmmaker Tom Shepard has produced, directed, and edited documentary films. 5 of his feature projects, Scouts Honor, Knocking, Whiz Kids, The Grove, and Unsettled, have aired nationally on PBS. Coverage of his work has been featured prominently in U.S. and foreign press, including reviews of 4 of his films in the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, San Francisco Chronicle, and Boston Globe, among others. Shepard's films have played in hundreds of film festivals worldwide, including Full Frame, the San Francisco International Film Festival, Silver Docs, and the Sundance Film Festival, where he has won 2 top awards. Shepard has received funding from the Independent Television Service 4 times, and support from California Humanities, the Enterprise Fund, the Jonathan Logan Family Foundation, among others. He is the former chairman of the New Day Films, and in 2013 founded the Youth Documentary Academy in Colorado, where he directs and teaches regularly. Prior to becoming an independent filmmaker, Shepard worked for Linda Werthemeyer as her editorial assistant at National Public Radio. He graduated from Stanford University, where he studied human biology and film. Please welcome Mr. Tom Shepard as we will begin the Q&A. And I ask you to send your questions through the chat to moderator Barbara Velasquez. And just don't miss out on this marvelous opportunity to ask a question, your favorite question, your most important thing that you got from this documentary of Mr. Tom Shepard.
Thank you, Barbara. It's such a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for including the film today.
Thank you. I've received several comments throughout the film about how powerful this documentary has been to watch. Thank you for bringing these stories. Let's see, what else do I have here? Just that it's been so meaningful. So we thank you all for coming today. And Tom, would you start by telling us, you've worked on many films. What is it about the theme or the many themes within Unsettled that caused you to dedicate yourself to this documentary?
Yeah, thank you. So we started the project in 2014, and I spent half my time in Colorado Springs and half my time in San Francisco, and I was looking around at my community, largely the LGBTQ community, and at that time, most folks, certainly in my circles, couldn't have even told you what the difference is between a refugee and an asylum seeker. And at that time, in terms of kind of gay civil rights, we had the marriage equality case, which was kind of steamrolling its way to the Supreme Court. So there was, partway through the Obama administration, some complacency, I think, certainly among the LGBTQ and queer communities. And Jewish Family and Community Services of the East Bay, which is an organization that's done refugee resettlement in the US for decades and decades, I mean, going way back, had gotten a first grant from the Secretary of State to resettle LGBTQ refugees. And I read a piece about it, and I just remember going over and asking them about the program. And it was, they were kind of pioneering this. And I think mentioned the idea of a film and what would it look like to maybe humanize this experience. Because I think, as I said, most people don't know the nuances in kind of refugee and asylum experiences, but, and then in particular, the unique experiences that LGBTQ refugees have. And so they kind of loved the idea and concept, but they were like, absolutely not. The clients that come through our service are all, victims, as you heard from Amy Weiss, of, pretty intense persecution, if not torture, often at the hands of their own families. And so they were super protective. But they said, would you like to volunteer? Because we really could use a lot of volunteers now. We're just starting this program up. And so I took that as an invitation to come for about 6 months and do some work on the ground and just start listening and watching and kind of understanding the story before we delved in. And that was really kind of the origin of the project. And I did meet Subi and Junior through that agency, and they ultimately agreed to, and the agency agreed to participate in having those stories told.
Thank you. That's very unique, I would guess, that someone had that opportunity to spend time as a volunteer with their subjects long before the project starts. So, and I was going to ask you how well you get to know the characters. So you probably know all them quite well now.
Yeah, it's been, since the end of 2014, early 2015 is when I met Shine and Marie as well. And I think because of the particular persecution stories, the issues of trust are so deep. And I think, just spending a lot of time getting to know them and getting to know them on their own terms, and like say, hey, look, we're not interested in, kind of swooping in and reducing this story to a quick piece or a hit piece, or, and I think they started to understand that over time. And so it was, it was a lot about just kind of patience. And of course, the adjudication process for Shine and Marie was also quite extended. I mean, it was 3 years from the time that they, filed the petition. So that was actually a few months after they'd arrived, that they even got their hearing in court, and so in immigration court. So we just kind of knew that we were going to be in it for the long haul. But I think that the advantage of that, of course, is to build more rapport and build more trust and, find some of the nuances of the story.
And you said you started in 2014. Did you tell us how long it took you to complete everything?
I mean, we were finishing the sound mix in California it was like a month before we premiered the film in late April of 2019. So it was, now, we're not sort of filming every week, every day. There are moments where there's time in between. And of course, a lot of that time we use to try and raise support for the project. And, documentary film is often this kind of pushing the rock up the hill and often needing to stop and raise support and all of that. But in this case, I think it maybe served the project well, just because you sort of wanted to see change over time. And so we were able to, capture that, I think, in the final edit, some of those changes. Yeah.
So there were many beautifully described, beautifully depicted parts of this documentary that I can see in the audience several people who work with immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers, and I'm sure that they were feeling like, wow, yeah, that's really true, and how well that shows. One of them was where Sufi is talking about, that you left something you had to leave, but you still miss things from behind, yet you can never go back to them. And it's common for immigrants that don't have the asylum issues, but then it's so much more compounded.
I think you're quite right. And refugee resettlement in this country has always been predicated on families. And so the whole, all of the refugee resettlement organizations typically are structured around welcoming families. So maybe you have a family from Iraq who, are fleeing a war-torn region of that country. And if they come to the Bay Area where I live, they'll immediately be connected into kind of Iraqi American and sort of the Iraqi diaspora. So maybe it's, a grocery store simply, or maybe it's legal services, or maybe it's a mosque, or maybe it's a community group. If you're a gay Iraqi guy and you land in the US, the last person that you probably want to see are other Iraqis or Iraqi Americans, because you have this fear, perceived or not, that that the vitriol is going to continue. And so, LGBTQ refugees are not fleeing with families. In most cases, they're fleeing from their own family. And that really makes this story a little more complicated. And that when we were starting the film, it seemed very clear that a lot of these great organizations, many of them with religious ties, just did not have the experience of knowing how to meet queer refugees at the doorstep. And what we found is that LGBTQ refugees become much more isolated, and the repetition of trauma and the lack of resources leads them into pretty precarious situations. And you saw that particularly in the story of Junior. And many of the advocates that work in this space point out that that's actually pretty commonplace. Like, his story is the norm.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's been interesting to watch in the US asylum and refugee organizations start to tune into, what it means to sort of address the unique needs of LGBTQ people that are fleeing.
In previous sessions, we've had chemical dependency counseling students with us. I don't know if we have any today, but right to go along with what you're saying, did you see strong efforts towards mental health preservation within the asylees that were coming in, or did they basically have to kind of find it on their own?
Sadly, the latter. And partly, I think it was a cultural issue for many of them, that to admit that they needed psychological help and therapy or trauma therapy was to admit weakness in an already precarious moment in their lives. And secondly, the real hard needs of housing and professional development, and just, having your basic toeholds in the society were so extreme that it almost pushed the mental health needs further down. And yet I can tell you, all the people that worked on our film, watching them over the years, by the end, they were like, we were pretty clear, like, those needs are number one. Like, none of that other stuff is going to matter if they continue to have this sort of repetition of trauma. And so for many of them, like Junior, turning to drinking, self-medicating, all of that makes a lot of sense when we see that they weren't able to engage those services. And I think, honestly, Jewish Family and Community Services were quite aware of that. Amy Weiss, who's interviewed in the film there, herself is a social worker and has a degree as a clinical therapist too. And I think started to make new programming available for some of the newer ones that were coming in. But I think it's a pretty insightful comment that you're making.
We have a lot more comments coming in from the audience than questions, but I'm going to share a few of them. Thank you so much for bringing real stories like this to us. I was moved to tears. The resilience was totally inspiring. And what you've said about refugees who fled from their own families as well as their countries is really, it's so strong. It's such a strong comment. Thank you. A question, and you can let me know if you have any comments to share on any of that, Tom, but a question we have is it safe for LGBTQ spirit people to travel to Europe? Can you answer that?
Yeah, great question. And by the way, it's so gratifying to hear comments like the ones you said, because especially, in COVID, where we really had to stop going to film festivals. We, broadcast the film on PBS in 2020. You just don't know, like, how people are receiving it. And so anyway, it's so great to have this kind of conversation and know that people are potentially impacted by, some of the stories. So thank you for sharing those. In terms of Europe, I would say we were able to actually bring the film before the pandemic to a couple of festivals in Europe, one in Prague and one in Germany and Berlin. And they had panel discussions of people that worked in the service, the refugee resettlement organizations there. And it became very clear that what is provided in Europe for LGBTQ refugees is much greater. And maybe they've had, more experience with it. And their societies are set up a little bit more robustly around some of those social safety net programs. So the other one is Canada. And I think it was very deliberate to end the film on Canada because Subi, availed himself of the gold standard of what existed in the US because he had become kind of a poster boy, and he knew some of the NGOs, both in the Middle East and in the US when he was coming, and he became quite connected to Jewish Family Community Service. He got the best that was available. And it was very interesting when he helped set up the sponsorship of his sister, who was resettled in Vancouver. And we went up there and it was like, holy smokes, like there were so many more resources available to her, trans swimming night on Wednesday nights, and language immersion right away. And a therapist was immediately assigned, and she had the option of, it was just like, okay, there are models that are different. And I think it's useful to look to, especially to Europe and to Canada around this particular one. So.
Thank you. So I have to preface by saying, yes, we all love our country. However, it's also evident that a lot of times people who live outside of the United States think it's more perfect than it is. Did you get the impression that any of the folks that you worked with were a little surprised by any of the challenges they had here after they came? Did they think it would be smoother?
Oh, gosh. I mean, and part of this is specific, I think, to what you're saying in the US and maybe just different priorities. But part of it is that San Francisco, California, has a whole mythology about being a kind of emerald city for LGBTQ people, a sort of a queer mecca, and that, maybe New York as well. But, it's been a place historically over the decades where people in this country who have felt stifled or unable to be themselves will sort of flee to internally, right? And so I think all of them had kind of like internalized that, like, it's going to be amazing if I can just get to San Francisco. And to a person, they were like, I think the issues of sexual orientation and gender identity quickly took a back seat, because it was like, try living on a refugee monthly benefit of $335 in one of the most expensive cities on the planet. And San Francisco just changed. I mean, I moved there from Colorado Springs in the mid 90s and could live in a group home with roommates and, pay $300 a month, and I could kind of find my tribe and find my voice as a gay person maybe, and you could do it then. That certainly is not the case. So it was like very jarring for all of them. And so, yeah, I think those stories that you see, which are much more about survival, are the ones that ended up being the heart of the film, and less about maybe the specific stories of, LGBT identity or gender identity, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and there, you had some data there too, where 70% of the asylum cases are denied. So, we didn't have to see that either. We saw some happy moments at the end. Even for Junior, things seem to be turning around.
Yeah.
And I don't want to make it political, but having this happen within the brash statements from our former president, do you sense that people felt any better when the administration's changed?
Well, I think two things about that. There was definitely the rhetoric, which, Donald Trump ran on back in 2016, which was just wasn't hiding this sort of anti-immigrant and anti-refugee sentiment, and that seemed to be playing to a particular constituency. And so there was the language stuff, and then there were just the numbers. Like, that's what was so shocking, is to see, like, toward the end of the Obama administration, the cap on refugees was somewhere around 110,000, and to see that drop to lower than 16,000 by 2020, it was just clear that it wasn't just about rhetoric. It was like that, those policies played out. So for the folks who supported that administration, I mean, he sort of lived up to those campaign promises. Biden has had a mixed record, I think, if you talk to most refugee and asylum folks, and initially was a bit slow, had made these commitments to getting it back to that level, and I think is maybe on that path. But yeah, I think, those folks that we met that are working like 24/7 on those issues just feel like so much more could be done by, one of the wealthiest countries in the world, given that many other countries who have far fewer resources provide much more support. And then they see the benefit of that. And there is a whole literature, if you look, on how refugees do, and some of our most successful US citizens, ultimate US citizens in the US, were refugees or first generation immigrants. And there's something about that work ethic and that feeling of such gratitude that they were able to flee an untenable situation and start new lives and then contribute back to that country. Like, that's the overwhelming evidence. And that's something that Donald Trump didn't include when he, was talking about refugee policies in his administration. So.
So the film was completed. You've been showing it. Do you keep up with any of the main characters, and what can you tell us about them?
Oh, great question. I do. I feel lucky, one, that they embrace the film. It's a very scary moment when you show a film like that to the subjects, and they've seen little bits of things over the years, and they were horrified to see themselves initially, but ultimately have really owned the film. And I think it's been great to see them have more agency, and that the film itself has given them a platform to be way more outspoken about these issues. One of the concerns about refugees in general, and especially LGBTQ refugees, is not only if they tell their story and it gets broadcast like this film did, that not only would it potentially put them in some difficult situation, but family members back home might be put in harm's way if members of that community saw a film that outed them as a gay person, for instance, or doing something that was just, you know, against the honor of the family, would potentially threaten them back home. And I know that that was a big concern for them. And so it just shows to me kind of how much courage and how much appetite they had to kind of have agency around this. So anyway, on that side, all was really great. And they've done a lot of these Q&As over the last couple of years, and it's great. But personally, I'll tell you, Shine, so you see the little postscripts at the end of the film. Shine and Marie moved to Las Vegas initially because they were tired of spending like 70% of their income on rent, and they wanted to get back to their music and performing. And so they have been able to do that. And then recently, in the last year, they moved to Salt Lake City. They had visited there for something and loved it and loved the mountains. And so they're living there and quite productive in terms of their performing. Cheyenne has put out a recording of a couple of songs that are actually derived from their lived experience as asylum seekers and stuff. Subi made it clear after the premiere and a few festivals that he went to, he's like, I am so tired of being in the limelight. I just want to have a normal life. He's working now. He's worked as a translator, and he's worked at Uber doing, I think, translation and stuff. And now I'm not quite sure what, he has another job, and he's living in a house in San Francisco with roommates. And, you know, it's, he's able to kind of afford it, but just has talked about, like, I just kind of want some normalcy in my life. So we don't often ask him to do public stuff anymore. And Junior has re-engaged with community college. He had to move out of San Francisco, but he's living about an hour away in the East Bay, and also is eligible and got a kind of a public housing accommodation that has supported his housing. And so he's hanging in there. And I think, you know, if he were here, he'd say it's still not easy. And I think, you know, there are times when it seems like he, you know, feels like it's some repeating of those experiences, but he's working toward getting a paralegal degree and wants to work in law. So.
Oh, wonderful. I really appreciated Junior's comment about people should respect me because I'm alive and continuing on, you know, because, you know, I think that's probably a feeling a lot of people have when they just feel like they keep hitting their head against the wall and nobody's telling me you're doing a good job, right?
So true. And more than that, people saying, you know, why do you continue to make bad choices? And so he's like, I think he would get that from folks, even the people that were trying to help him, this sort of judgment of, and you know, I guess his point in that moment, in that comment, was like, just, you know, I could so easily not be here. And so give me some slack, basically.
Yeah. And for all of us, I think, well, I will say several weeks ago, we showed another documentary, and I'm trying to remember what it was, but it reflected on something about someone who'd come here from another country. And one of the viewers, who happens to be with us here today, said that she left her office and had a completely different type conversation with an international student than she would have normally had. And she felt so excited that she was able to that quickly employ what she had learned, what was personal to her about it. So I feel really confident that that's going to happen again today. And I know that time is flying. So I'm going to allow you, Tom, to share your final message with our audience today.
Oh, well, thank you. You know, I'll just say something about that. And I said it a little before, which is that, you know, funders of documentary are always trying to ask us, like, how do you demonstrate impact, you know, or how do you quantify impact? And it's a really good question. Like, how does watching a film like this impact the world? You know, like, often we don't know as filmmakers, but that story that you just said, or, you know, will someone see this film or the film you were referring to before and maybe be more likely to read more articles in the international section of the newspaper? Or, you know, will they look at a potential policy differently, or will they vote differently, or will they have a conversation? I mean, I think, you know, that's the power of documentary, right? Is that it can in some ways catalyze conversations about difficult issues in a way that is fairly non-threatening, that if it's done right and if it humanizes a complex issue, then people can just speak more a little bit from the heart. And you sort of think, okay, well, if hearts can open, then maybe minds can open more. But we're living in a society right now that is more polarized than I can, any time that I can remember. And so in my view, I love these opportunities. I teach kids now. We're in our 9th year this summer teaching the Youth Documentary Academy. And these young people come from such different backgrounds, political backgrounds in their families, religious, ethnic, but the one common denominator is that they come with real respect for each other's stories, and they learn to be respectful, inquisitive interrogators of each other. And then the films they produce allow our community in Colorado Springs to have conversations about difficult things, but they're coming from the hearts of these young people. And I just, I guess in defense of this kind of media that tries to bring the rhetorical noise down a little bit and just have more heart-to-heart conversations and respect that people are coming from really different backgrounds with different lived experiences that inform their politics or inform their attitudes and beliefs. So anyway, just I guess a huge appreciation to you all for getting the film and showing it there. And again, we work with a community college here in San Francisco, so I feel really simpatico with your institution, and it just appreciate being able to speak with you today. So
thank you very much. I do want to remind our audience members who are students or personnel employees here at Metropolitan Community College. We're really fortunate to have a library system that supports what we do. So for almost every documentary that we show, they also purchase a perpetual screening license. So if you would like to see this again, or you would like to encourage somebody else to see it, go through the library and find out how you can access that. It is virtual, so you can watch it at home, you can watch it any place. If you are not connected to the college, it's my understanding that you can go into the library and ask them to show it to you there. So I hope that you will take that opportunity. It's really great for our faculty who might want to show it to their students. And thanks to Mr. Shepard, we are recording the Q&A, as you can see, so you'd be able to watch it and then view these comments. So thank you, Metro Libraries. Thank you, Mr. Shepard. And now thank you, Joe, who's been our technician. Would you please put up the slide for the online evaluation? This is also in the chat, so you could quickly go out there and click on that link and just go straight to the online evaluation, which gives us great feedback. And then we are coming into our final week of programming for the academic year. Monday, we will be with Dr. Jonathan Paul Higgins, who is a writer and social justice educator focused on gender, race, and media. And he's going to have a conversation with us. He'll talk a little bit about the power of unlearning. The system is invisible on purpose. I love that title. Can't wait to hear his take on that. And then we're going to do long session of Q&A. So come back with your good questions. That is Monday, June 27th, 2:30 p.m. Central Daylight Time. And that's also in the chat, so you can click on the registration link and have yourself all ready for next Monday. Thanks, everybody. Have a great evening. And we really appreciate your being here.